Tom is the grandson of Admiral Husband Kimmel, sink pack at Pearl Harbor. And as I've gotten to know Tom, there's a great family history here that we probably can't talk about as a part of the presentation. But he had 3 sons. One was lost in a submarine at the start of the war, or during the war. And it has been a Naval Academy family tradition.
What I hope to do today is to make it clear, make no mistake, that I want to fix responsibility, true responsibility for the success of the Pearl Harbor attack. My 35 years of government service has made it clear to me that this exercise that I'm about to engage you in is necessary. Please bear with me. Consider this, if you would. Don Patton is responsible for having me here today in the same sense that Admiral Kimmel and General Short were responsible for their duties in Hawaii, in the sense that Don had to properly respond to information that he had in getting me here today. Now, what does that tell us? Well, my 35 years of government service tells me that it doesn't tell us much. In the government, we like to bandy about this idea of responsibility, frequently to obscure, to obfuscate. Alexander Hamilton wrote all about that in the Federalist Papers, number 70. Consider further, Don Patton is accountable for everything he did and did not do in getting me here today, just like Admiral Kimmel and General Short. Few people in the history of the Republic have had to account more for their actions or lack of action than Admiral Kimmel and General Short. And Don Patton is in the same situation as far as my presence is here today. He's accountable for everything he did and did not do in getting me here today.
And the weather.
Now what have we learned? We still haven't learned much. What we really want to know, is Don blamable for having me here today? And ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, for you to decide, should he be punished for having me here today? This term blamable is terribly important. That's what we're really after. Of course, Admiral Kimmel was responsible and accountable for everything that happened in Hawaii. The question is he blamable? Should he be punished? In 1948, the official naval historian appointed by both Presidents Roosevelt and President Truman to write the official history of the United States Navy, and I'm talking about Samuel Eliot Morison. Samuel Eliot Morison went about his task and wrote a multi-volume work at the direction of the President of the United States about official naval operations in World War II. The 3rd volume was The Rising Sun in the Pacific. He wrote it in 1948. He was very unkind and unsympathetic to Admiral Kimmel. But in 1961, he underwent an investigative epiphany and completely changed his mind. In a letter to the head of the Naval Academy Alumni Association, Admiral Shafroth, and also in an article in the Saturday Evening Post, Samuel Eliot Morison said Admiral Kimmel was no more blamable than a number of people in Washington. Turner, the head of Navy War Plans, Garreau, the head of Army War Plans, Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Miles, the head of Army Intelligence, and Admiral Wilkinson, the head of Navy Intelligence. And he also threw in Admiral Stark in his Saturday Evening Post article of the same flavor. If I were pushed to name one person as being more careless or stupid than all the rest, it would be who? Or is it whom? Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner. And here's the key phrase that I want you to take home with you. If you, Admiral Shafroth, and your Naval Academy friends are getting up any sort of petition to have Admiral Kimmel's status restored or record changed, you can count on me to sign it. Another famous Pearl Harbor historian, Roberta Wallstetter, is largely responsible for changing my views and ought to be thanked. We're going to explore why Samuel Eliot Morison changed his mind. But first, it's impossible to have a discussion about Pearl Harbor without having some idea what magic is. It was a word coined, dreamed up by the then head of the Office of Naval Intelligence to include and referring to any decrypted Japanese code message, or at least says Roberta Wallstetter. I can't begin to tell you how many times I have sat and listened to people say, the Japanese, that magic provided no indications of the Pearl Harbor attack because the diplomats were not aware of what was going on in the military. Magic involved all of the decoded material. And it certainly involved, at the very least, the Purple Code, which was a specialized diplomatic code, and a lesser code called J-19 and PAK-2, which involved dramatic amounts of military information. And indeed, the spies used the J-19 code because at Hawaii, there was no purple machine for the Japanese. So all the spies in Japan had to use J-19. And as a consequence, magic in its generic form provided indications of the time, place, reason, and deceit plan to cover the Pearl Harbor attack. What's really interesting about that, and we've only found out about this in the recent past, is that the man President Roosevelt designated to be the head of internal security for the United States, J. Edgar Hoover, he did not receive magic information, even though the primary enemy at the time for subversion in the United States was, of course, the Japanese, because that's what we were working on. Not only did J. Edgar Hoover not receive this information, but the head of the organization designated by the President of the United States as responsible for external security, and I'm talking about Wild Bill Donovan, the coordinator of information, the precursor of the Office of Strategic Services, and of course, the CIA. He didn't have magic. But what have we very recently learned? That there is very good reason to believe that the Soviets actually had access to their own magic and had broken several codes. I have firsthand information on this because we got it from two almost unimpeachable sources. One of them was Vasily Matroikin. I can't verify Vasily Matroikin's information coming out of the KGB. He was an archivist. He came out in the 1990s with armloads full of KGB materials that he had smuggled out of Russia. It was a treasure trove of information. Some of that information was directly sent to me in my duties in the FBI at the time. This part of Matroikin's information I can verify, and that part concerned the identification of an NSA spy who had spied in the 1960s. NSA in Maryland. We, the FBI, agents, my predecessors, had labored in the 1960s trying to figure out why the Soviets had illegals coming through Minersville, Pennsylvania, because there's nothing in Minersville, Pennsylvania. And yet the Soviets were sending illegals into Minersville, Pennsylvania. A remarkable occurrence, and we couldn't figure out why. I don't even join the FBI until 1973, but the case is wide open when I get there. In the 1990s, we find out why the Soviets had sent illegals in the 1960s to Minersville, Pennsylvania, because Vasily Matroikin identified for us by name the name of the spy. It was Robert Lipka. You might remember the case. Through some remarkable work by some Philadelphia FBI agents, we were able to make the case in court against Robert Lipka. He had been stealing NSA blind for years, and the illegals were coming by Minersville to pick up the material. Maybe I spent too long on that, but this is the same fellow that gave us indications that Stalin had access to magic, and it contributed to his decision to send divisions away from the front to confront the Germans instead of leaving them there worried about the Japanese in the backside. We also have the remarkable diary in 2005 from the head of MI5's counterintelligence section, Guy Liddell. Guy Liddell identifies in his diary prior to the Pearl Harbor attack the fact that he had sent Anthony Blunt down to GCHQ prior to Pearl Harbor to get smart on the British breaking of the Japanese codes and the magic. Well, Anthony Blunt is a famous Cambridge spy, so it doesn't take much imagination to assume that he was passing that information on to the Soviets. Okay, this idea of magic is so important to the Pearl Harbor story and so important to Admiral Kimmel's defense, if you will. It's more than merely Admiral Kimmel not getting this information. By not getting it in the manner in which he didn't get it, it was actually misleading to the point where we refer to it as having him affirmatively misled. And I don't think there's anybody more qualified to explain that than Admiral Kimmel's counsel.
On Oahu, the naval and army commanders heard nothing of the Japanese reactions to the embargoes. They were advised that although the bans were enforced, no hostile reaction by Japan was expected. Kimmel, Hanafi believes, was badly served.
Pearl Harbor did not have the purple machine which was necessary to intercept the critical Japanese diplomatic messages. As a consequence, Kimmel was dependent upon Washington to get him that type of intelligence. From time to time, he received messages indicating that he was getting some of the intercepts. He expected that he would get all of that type of information which affected his disposition. He had specifically asked for intelligence information that bore upon his problem of defense of the fleet and the base, and he'd been assured he was going to get it. So the absence of the machine and the sporadic intercepts which he got lulled him into a false security in the belief he was getting the intelligence which he needed, and he wasn't.
Probably be a good idea to have the old man explain it himself.
We needed one thing, which our own resources could not make available to us. That vital need was the information available in Washington from the intercepted dispatches, which told when and where Japan would probably strike. I did not get this information.
I come to you as an FBI investigator. Let's investigate the attack. If you were going to investigate what happened after the proceedings, what would you do first? Well, how about get the Chief of Naval Operations on the stand, put him under oath, and ask him, who told you, Chief of Naval Operations Stark, that Admiral Kimmel had the ability to decode magic out in Hawaii? Well, Admiral Stark was asked that question, and he immediately coughed up his Chief of Naval War Plans, Admiral Turner. So the next step is to get Admiral Turner on the stand, and that's what we did. The Joint Congressional Committee by Congressman Murphy asked Admiral Turner, did you, Admiral Turner, ever tell Admiral Stark that Admiral Kimmel was getting that information, that magic information? Admiral Turner, being an honorable man, said, yes, sir, on 3 occasions. I asked Admiral Noyes, the Director of Naval Communications, about it, and so reported back to Admiral Stark, the Chief of Naval Operations. I went through this exercise on 3 occasions, he testified. The first time was in January of 1941, actually 1 month before Kimmel took over the Pacific Fleet. The second time he reported back to Chief of Naval Operations Stark was in July or August of 1941. Kimmel is getting this magic information. He has the ability to receive it out there in Hawaii. He has the same abilities in Hawaii as we have in Washington, D.C. So said Admiral Turner. He went through it for a third time in November of 1941, all with the same outrageous result that Kimmel was getting this information. The next step in the investigation was to put Admiral Noyes on the stand. Admiral Noyes was asked that question, and Admiral Noyes said, responding to the question, did you tell Admiral Turner that Kimmel was getting the magic? And Noyes said, no. That, I can tell you as an investigator, is an investigative epiphany. Where else are you going to go with your investigation now? There's nowhere else to go. So what happened next? Well, the Roberts Commission, in sewing circle fashion in Washington, D.C., talked to the High Command in Washington, D.C. This is the High Command, the Navy and the Army's High Command. And as a result of a report of that meeting by the Director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, Admiral Wilkinson, we found out that the Roberts Committee meeting was discussing magic freely. But it gets much worse. Admiral Wilkinson said, Admiral Hart, the commander of the Asiatic Fleet in the Philippines, and Admiral Kimmel, the commander of the Pacific Fleet in Hawaii, had available to them the same magic information as we did here in Washington, D.C. And indeed, Admiral Hart did have access to magic out in the Philippines. But then he went one step further and he said, even though Admiral Hart in the Philippines and Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii had access to this magic, nevertheless, warning dispatches had been sent out as though it was an unnecessary redundancy, as though the warning message should be read in the light of all the magic messages that Kimmel had, so said Wilkinson. Admiral Stanley, a former Chief of Naval Operations, repudiated the findings of the Roberts Commission and styled Chairman Roberts' performance as chairman of the Roberts Commission as crooked as a snake. I'm going to discuss that in a little bit. But first, I want to change gears just slightly. The highlight of the Joint Congressional Committee investigation, clearly the highlight of the investigation, was the testimony of Lester Sholes, Commander Lester Sholes, who later became the director of the Office of Naval Intelligence. At 9:30 p.m., Saturday, December 6th, in the evening, he delivered to the President of the United States the Japanese response to the famous November 26, 1941 American Note, or ultimatum, if you prefer, from the Secretary of State Cordell Hull. The response was to be in 14 parts. And of course, we knew this before the Japanese ambassadors in Washington, D.C. knew it, because we were reading magic at that time like a book. We were actually reading it before the Japanese ambassadors were in Washington, D.C. The 13th part came in the evening of December 6, 1941. Lester Sholes, testifying under oath before the Joint Congressional Committee, described the delivery of that 13th part. He gave it to the President of the United States. The President of the United States declared, "This means war." He turned it to his #1 confidant, Karl Rove, Harry Hopkins. And Harry Hopkins agreed, this means war. As an investigator, what would this tell you? The commander-in-chief has just received a secret communication from the enemy. Declares this means war. What would he be doing? What would be the logical thing for him to do? What would be his duty to do? To notify the head of his army and the head of his navy as soon as possible. Well, that became the investigative focus for the remainder of all of the Pearl Harbor investigations. Let's see how that went. General Marshall on the stand, famously, was asked where he was. On December 6th in the evening, General Marshall, perhaps the smartest man to ever be in the United States Army, VMI graduate of distinction, renowned for his photographic memory, praised by President Truman for that very fact. You, General Marshall, Chief of Staff of the Army, with the primary responsibility of warning our armed forces worldwide of the threat, where were you, sir, when your only boss was reading a secret dispatch from the enemy and declaring this means war? What was his famous response? Anybody?
I don't remember.
I don't remember. Thank you. There was still plenty of time Sunday morning. Because recall, when the final response was put together, the 14th part, we had yet another message telling the ambassadors in Washington to deliver the response, which incidentally was written in English. There was no need to translate it, because obviously the Japanese were making a statement for history. For history. Trying to rationalize and explain what they were about to do for history. It's in English. General Marshall, where were you when your boss received this secret information, declared this means war? And we then later got the 14th part on Sunday morning. Where were you Sunday morning, sir? General Marshall said he didn't have any independent recollection, but his usual practice was to go horseback riding on Sunday morning in Rock Creek Park. So he really gave a very garbled response to that. Investigators now, frustrated out of their socks, said, okay, General, you don't know where you were the night before when your boss was declaring this means war. You're not exactly sure of your movement Sunday morning. Where were you, sir, when you actually got the word that Pearl Harbor was under attack? You can find that response in Volume 3 of the Joint Congressional Committee's Pearl Harbor Attack Series at page 1109. What did Churchill say when he was asked the question, where were you when you got the word that Pearl Harbor was under attack? Anybody remember that? Thank you. What did he say? Satiated with satisfaction and emotion, I went to sleep and slept the sleep of the saved and the thankful. A little bit different than I don't know where I was. But I, of course, focus on the Navy. What about the Navy? That's what I want to know. Admiral Stark, where were you, sir, when your only boss, the commander-in-chief, was reading the secret communication Saturday evening and declaring this means war? Where were you, sir? The Joint Congressional Committee put him under oath and asked him that question on January 2nd, 1946, and Admiral Stark said, I don't know where I was that evening. Nobody reached me. The next day, further questioning by the Joint Congressional Committee, they asked him the same question. They got the same response. I don't recall where I was. The Joint Congressional Committee closed. They shut down their operations. And they shut down their operations on May 23rd, 1946. And then a week later, Admiral Stark's flag lieutenant, Captain Crick, went to see Admiral Stark and said, "Admiral, don't you remember where you were, sir, Saturday evening? You were with me, sir. You were with me and our wives. We went to the National Theater. We saw the student prince. After the show, we retired to your quarters. You excused yourself to take a telephone call in the bedroom. When you came back out, you told us the President of the United States was on the phone and you were discussing the critical situation in the Pacific. Don't you remember that, sir?" Admiral Stark, now obviously between the devil and the deep blue sea, went back to the chairman of the Joint Congressional Committee, put him between a rock and a hard place, and they reconvened the Joint Congressional Committee. We've got a little bit of a loose end here that we've got to do something with now. And you see what happened. Crick puts his story in front of the Joint Congressional Committee under oath, and they put Stark back on the stand, and Stark says he still does not recall where he was. The chairman of the Joint Congressional Committee said, "Could you, Admiral Stark, have been with General Marshall, since he can't remember either?" And Stark actually replies and said, "I think we had no such conspiracy at that time, sir." Famously, Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral King, who took over for Stark when Stark was fired effectively, although Stark was given another job, a 4-star job in the UK, and served admirably. Admiral King, I've never been able to understand how or why FDR could fire Admiral Stark without doing the same to General Marshall. In my opinion, one could not possibly be more suspect than the other. Recently, the former director of the Office of Naval Intelligence, Tom Brooks, wrote this for the Naval Institute of Proceedings. Kimmel's superiors committed perjury, suborned perjury, destroyed evidence, and intimidated witnesses. Testimony during the 9 investigations presents a sordid picture of Washington officials covering themselves at the expense of the 2 Pearl Harbor commanders. Kimmel and Short's seniors in Washington shared culpability and acted in a disgraceful fashion in their attempt to deflect all the blame. For this reason alone, a compelling case can be made to restore Kimmel and Short to their pre-war ranks. Time to shift focus again. There is a story within the Pearl Harbor story. This is part of the story. That's my dad, Naval Academy 1936. That's Admiral Kimmel. This is my dad's older brother, Manning. And this is my great-grandfather, class of 57. That would be 1857. As I'm sure you've already figured out, perilously close to the Civil War. And indeed, my great-grandfather fought the first Battle of Manassas, or Bull Run if you prefer, for the United States Army. But he was from Kentucky. After the battle, he went back to Kentucky and considered his options. And he opted to fight the rest of the war for the Confederate States Army. And fight he did. He fought at Vicksburg, Holly Springs, Corinth, Pea Ridge, Magruder's Raiders, and a host of other lesser engagements, and miraculously survived the war. Or we would not be having this conversation this evening. These are the 3 submarines that my dad was on. S-40, a floating coffin, was in Manila Bay when the Japanese attacked. The habitability of S-40 was so bad that nobody stayed on board the ship when she was alongside the pier. So my dad was actually in the bachelor officer quarters, along with several others. They got the word that Pearl Harbor was under attack about 2 hours after it was attacked. he strolled down to the front office of the BOQ, and they said, Pearl Harbor's under attack. My dad said he didn't believe him. And he got back to the duty officer, back to the ship, and he said, I understand Pearl Harbor's under attack. He said, yeah. He said, well, what did you do? And he said, I went and strapped on my .45. How many submarines were in Manila Bay when Pearl Harbor was attacked? Sitting there at anchor or alongside the tender or alongside the pier with no special precautions, no special instructions. Anybody want to take a guess? There were 26 submarines alongside the pier, alongside the tender, or anchored. There were 3 more outside of Manila Bay. Admiral Hart had 29 submarines with no special precautions, no special instructions. Consider this. If the Japanese had attacked those 29 submarines, or the 26 that were sitting ducks, instead of the 8 battleships at Pearl Harbor, they would have increased their war effort by an order of magnitude. Because as Tojo said before he was hung, he was responding to the question, what do you think are the reasons why the Japanese lost the war? And he gave 3 reasons. Recall what they are? In no priority order. Fast carrier attacks from the United States, attrition from submarines, and island hopping tactics, in no particular order. Battleships didn't figure in on that. These are the 3 submarines that my uncle, my dad's older brother, were on during the war. He was on Drum at Midway. He was on Rattan when Lapon fired 2 torpedoes. Lapon's another U.S. submarine. Fired 2 torpedoes at Rattan, bounced off their hull in the South China Sea. But fortunately, in a manner of speaking, the torpedoes, the American torpedoes for the first 2.5 years of the war, as a general proposition, did not work. Or my uncle never would have made it to commanding officer of the Robolo. And Robolo was lost with all hands sometime in 1944 or 45. We're not exactly sure because nothing was ever recovered. Moving along, Admiral Kimmel had 3 sons. The oldest boy was killed in the war, my dad, and a much younger son who also fought on Navy ships in World War II. He fought on the Vixen and the Ranger. But he strayed badly and went to the Ivy League, graduating from Princeton and Harvard Law School. He is largely responsible for obtaining some very important legislation, which I have alluded to in a handout. I only had 25 of them. But let me say this about that. This is perhaps my favorite picture of all time. And the reason for it is simple, because I know how difficult it was for the Time Life photographers that took this photograph in 1991 to get both my dad and my uncle smiling like they are here. This may be the most important thing that I leave with you this evening, and that is that in 1984, the then president of the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, in 1984 it was still a large organization, they summoned, the president, Alex Cobb, summoned my dad and my uncle to a restaurant in New York and asked my dad and my uncle to assist the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association in rehabilitating the reputations of Admiral Kimmel and General Short, their commanders. The Pearl Harbor Survivors Association had had enough. My dad and my uncle looked at each other and said, my goodness, if the men who suffered the most from the Pearl Harbor attack want our support, who are we to do anything but give our all? And they did. My uncle, the lawyer, is largely responsible for obtaining legislation in 2000 that the Congress passed, recommending that the president, whoever the president was then, whoever the president may be in the future, to posthumously advance Admiral Kimmel and General Short on the retired list to their highest held temporary ranks, as they are the only two persons otherwise qualified under the Officer Personnel Act of 1947 who have not received that benefit. The important point here is that this advancement initiative, which doesn't cost a thing, incidentally, began with the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association. Did not begin with the Kimmel family. But I am about continuing my dad's work. Okay, here's the real story within the Pearl Harbor story. 9 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, the President of the United States selected a sitting Supreme Court Associate Justice, Owen Roberts, to go out to Hawaii and investigate the Army and the Navy only, and then only in Hawaii. 10 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Kimmel and General Short were fired and replaced. 11 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, Associate Justice Roberts began his deliberations. He investigated for a grand total of 36 days. 47 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, he filed a report, sent it to the President of the United States, who demanded to see it before it was released. The President liked it because it cast sole blame. It declared Admiral Kimmel and General Short solely blamable for the success of the Japanese attack and derelict in their duty, and made specific mention that the President, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, the Secretary of the Navy, the Chief of Staff of the Army, and Admiral Stark did a great job, even though that wasn't even part of their brief. 47 days after the Pearl Harbor attack, that's the end of the story. Soup to nuts, that's all that would have happened. But for this remarkable whistleblower, the head of Op 20G, Captain Lawrence Safford, the revered father of naval communications intelligence, the #1 man, secretly went to see my grandfather living in Bronxville, New York, in disgrace, a beaten, despondent man. Captain Safford turned to Admiral Kimmel and said, "Admiral, did you have available to you in Hawaii the same information we had available to us in Washington, D.C. from the secret decoding of Japanese diplomatic and spy communications, which gave us indications, Admiral, prior to the attack of the time, place, reason, and deceit plan to cover the attack? Did you have that information available to you?" Admiral Kimmel looked at Captain Safford and said, "Captain, what in the world are you talking about?" Safford explained, "That very day, my grandfather turned into a fighting tiger. He got himself legal representation out of Boston. The junior counsel, Ed Hannafy, actually wrote the enabling legislation that he took to the Naval Affairs Committee with Safford's information. The Naval Affairs Committee was so impressed by what they saw that they took it to the full Congress. And the full Congress ordered the Army and the Navy to conduct further investigations. And that's where you wind up with the remaining 8 investigations. That's the real story within the Pearl Harbor story. 8 of these investigations were caused to occur directly as a result of efforts by Admiral Kimmel, and the last one by his 2 surviving sons, in which for the first time 54 years later, we got an admission from the government that Kimmel and Short were not solely responsible. That took 54 years. This is the update. As a result of mainly of the effort of my uncle, but with great assistance from my dad, they prevailed in 2000 upon Senator Joe Biden from Delaware and his colleague, Senator Roth from Delaware, who was the Republican, to come together and sponsor legislation that recommended to the President that they advance Kimmel and Short. For a variety of reasons, that has not occurred. And as I was reviewing the landscape in August, I suddenly recognized that we had a new Secretary of Defense And something in the back of my mind clicked. So I went and checked the roll call vote on that legislation back in 1999 and 2000. And lo and behold, I found that the now Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel, back in those days, was a senator from Nebraska. And he voted for the legislation. So I thought, well, my goodness, since we've been in contact with Vice President Biden's office, and Vice President Biden tells us that the hang-up on this recommendation from the Congress in 2000 is hung up with the Department of Defense, I thought this might be a good opportunity to reacquaint Secretary of Defense Hagel with his Senate vote in 1999. And this is the letter. It's short. I'm going to read it to you. It's available on my website. I had 25 copies, and hopefully there are 25 copies circulating around here. Mr. Secretary, the record reflects that Vice President Biden sponsored and you voted for the 1999 Senate bill recommending posthumous advancement in rank for Rear Admiral Kimmel and Major General Short. The Vice President has said that the Kimmel and Short matter is the most tragic injustice in American military history. His office recently advised that the matter rests with the Department of Defense. I urge you to end this historical injustice by recommending to the President that he honor the will of the Congress and the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association by nominating Kimmel and Short for advancement. The Department of Defense's inaction is perceived by many as obstructing the will of the Congress and the Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, who began this advancement initiative in 1984. I also included that, indicated that I had enclosed background information specific to Rear Admiral Kimmel. There were 5 points to be made. The first one was that the giants of World War II, and I'm talking about 3 of the 5 five-star admirals in the history of the United States Navy. Who are the other 2? Leahy, who never said a thing about Pearl Harbor or Admiral Kimmel or General Short that I'm aware of. Correct me if I'm wrong. And Dewey, who was of a different era. On my handout, I, of course, quote all of them. I don't have time to quote them all now. But I should point out that if there had been a 6th five-star admiral, it would have been Admiral Spruance, the famous hero from the Battle of Midway. And, of course, Admiral Kinkaid was the commander of the 7th Fleet during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the biggest battle in the history of the world by a measure. I'll give you one quote because I think it's the most important quote that has come from a giant of World War II. And that was from Nimitz. Anytime I get in trouble in my arguments about Kimmel, I like to hide behind Admiral Nimitz. Nimitz wrote that the Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, was wrong in blaming Kimmel. Admiral Kimmel had been given no information which would justify interrupting a very urgent training schedule. This comes from Admiral Nimitz. So if you don't like the arguments for Kimmel, take it up with Nimitz. Next we get to the 4-star admirals that the then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney wanted us to appeal to. My dad, who knew a lot of them, contacted them and asked for endorsements, and boy did he get them. We have 6 former Chiefs of Naval Operations, 2 former Chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 1 former Director of Central Intelligence, and 26 other 4-star admirals who are on record in writing as supporting this action for Admiral Kimmel. You can get the details on my website. The third item that I tried to make the Secretary Hagel cognizant of, that the only tribunal of the 10 tribunals, 9 of which were active when Admiral Kimmel was alive, Admiral Kimmel deceased in 1968, 9 of these tribunals occurred during his lifetime, and only 1 accorded him the opportunity to defend himself. And by defend himself, I mean the opportunity to call and to cross-examine witnesses. At the Dorn Tribunal, the 10th one, we actually had the Chief Counsel of the Navy, Steve Honickman, offer in front of Senator Thurman, the Secretary of the Navy, and the acting Secretary of Defense, Deputy John Deutsch. He actually said that Kimmel should not be advanced because he had his opportunity before the Joint Congressional Committee to call and to cross-examine witnesses, which is just flat wrong. The only tribunal that accorded him that opportunity was the Naval Court of Inquiry. So you would think, in our system of jurisprudence, that it would have more weight than those that did not accord the man accused to defend himself. What did the Naval Court of Inquiry find? The Naval Court of Inquiry found that there was not a scintilla of evidence to support a charge of dereliction of duty against Admiral Kimmel. They offered that he committed no errors of judgment on the basis of information that he was given. They approved of all of his forced dispositions, again, on the basis of information that he was given. The president of the court, Admiral Murfin, opined that they, the Naval Court of Inquiry, thought that Admiral Kimmel had done everything possible under the political circumstances at that time. And they made one further finding, and that was to severely criticize Admiral Kimmel's only uniformed boss, the Chief of Naval Operations, for not keeping Kimmel adequately and appropriately informed of developments in Washington as he had promised to do on multiple occasions. The fourth point I wanted to make, we keep hearing that there's nothing new in the Pearl Harbor story, and that's why they're not going to follow the recommendation of the Congress. I could give you 40 examples of new information. Obviously, I don't have time to do anything like that. So I'll give you two. The first one, which occurred long after the Dorn report in 1995, was the product of research by Professor Michael Gannon from the University of Florida, a real gentleman and a scholar, and has the best book on Pearl Harbor that I am aware of, Pearl Harbor Betrayed. If you can't get it, send me an email. I can help you out with this. Professor Gannon found out that the key question in Hawaii was, were the battleships safe from aerial torpedo attack? Admiral Kimmel in Hawaii and the Office of Naval Intelligence and the Turner's Office of War Plans went up and down the flagpole on this issue many times. And it was determined that no Navy in the world had the capability of successfully airdropping a torpedo in water as shallow as that in Hawaii. 42 feet in the channel, 30 feet outside the channel. It was not thought anybody had that capability. And yet we find out in 2001, we find out that the Navy declassified in 1998 a report from the then Naval Attaché to London, the famous commander of Submarines Pacific, Charles Lockwood, who was my dad and my uncle's boss. My dad never knew of this information, which I'm about to give you. In a report dated July 15th, 1941, 6 months prior to Pearl Harbor, the Naval Attaché in London was told by the British that they had the capability of successfully airdropping a torpedo in 24 feet of water. And that report not only was never sent to Admiral Kimmel, it was never made available to any of the investigations. The second example, and I found this one out on my own, partially because I'm an FBI agent. The head of counterintelligence for Army G2 in Washington, D.C. was John Terbush Bissell. John Terbush Bissell secretly went to the FBI 5 days after the Pearl Harbor attack and told the FBI that about 10 days prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, authorities in the Army and the Navy in Hawaii had intercepted the complete plans for the Japanese attack. And they had also intercepted the code words, which indicated that the attack would take place on a Friday or a Saturday. but they couldn't break the code. So they sent it to the Army Code Breaking Center in Washington, and they broke the code, the Army did, and sent the information back to Hawaii. Well, J. Edgar Hoover knew he had a hot potato, to say the least. If that information were true, that the complete plans for the Pearl Harbor attack were decoded by the Army in D.C. and sent back to Hawaii, not only should Admiral Kimmel have been fired and replaced, he should have been shot. So, what did Hoover do with the information? He immediately sent it to the President of the United States. The next day, he put it in writing to the President of the United States, and we have the letter. But it wasn't until 2007 that we determined who John Terbush Bissell was. That had been redacted in previous efforts. And he gave it to an FBI agent by the name of Gordon, as I recall. A week after that, J. Edgar Hoover sent the information to the head of the Roberts Commission, the sitting Supreme Court Associate Justice. Not only did he send him that information, he sent him some investigative guidance on how he should handle that information. He should find out who it was that received this information and what was done about it. So, Justice Roberts headed off to Hawaii and put the head of Army Intelligence under oath and asked him, did you get this information from Washington, D.C.? And the head of Army Intelligence out there, Fiedler is his name, looked at Justice Roberts and, I don't know what you're talking about. So Roberts went on and asked the same question to his assistant, Colonel Bicknell. Did you get this complete plans information and this notice of code words about the attack possibly taking place on Friday or Saturday? And Bicknell said, I don't know what you're talking about. No, I didn't get anything like that. 5 years later, at the Joint Congressional Committee, Senator Ferguson is reviewing the Roberts Commission transcripts, and he sees these very peculiar questions being asked the head of Army Intelligence and the assistant head of Army Intelligence out in Hawaii. And he asks Justice Roberts, who's now a witness under oath, what were you talking about with those questions? Mr. Roberts, what were you talking about? And his answer was, I don't recall. Where did you get this information? They went through this exercise 3 times. Where did you get this information to ask the question? I don't recall. I don't recall. Thrice. He got it in writing from the FBI, from the director of the FBI. He got it in writing. And of course, we didn't know that until mid-2000. Okay, this is the last one you'll be delighted to know. The last point I wanted to make is the relief that we are requesting is modest. We're not asking for any money. We're not asking for an apology. All we're asking is to be treated the same way every other general and flag officer was treated in World War II. Admiral Kimmel and General Short are the only 2 qualified officers under the Officer Personnel Act that were not given the benefit of the act. The Dorn report did help us out in this one respect. They researched the file and reported that there is no reason given in the file why Kimmel and Short were denied this benefit. But they also, then Dorn also went on to say in curious language that it wouldn't be proper to award Kimmel and Short this because you should only be awarded this benefit if you merit it. Well, of course, we researched that matter a little bit. And once again, Professor Gannon came to our assistance and pointed out from his research that we have Major General Friedendahl, is that what it was, at the Kasserine Pass, who was fired after losing 10,000 men, 6,000 Americans, to the Germans 2,000. We have Major General Lucas at Anzio, who was fired after disastrous performance. But clearly my favorite is General Henry Miller, Major General Henry Miller. He's part of the Army Air Corps staff of General Spaatz. He's out there at Claridge's restaurant. He has way too much to drink. He starts taking bets as to when D-Day is going to occur. Spaatz finds out about it, puts him under arrest. Eisenhower finds out about it, sends him back to the United States and busts him to a colonel. He also was given the benefit of that Officer Personnel Act of 1947, in spite of what Secretary Dorn has to say. But the final nail in the coffin was the information that we gave to the Dorn Committee when Admiral Kimmel was trying to support himself after Pearl Harbor. He was offered a job by the best builder of floating dry docks in the world, Admiral Harris of the Harris Engineering Company. Harris hired Kimmel to run the San Francisco office. Kimmel was on his way to do that. The Navy Department apparently found out about that, called up Harris and said, if you continue to employ Kimmel, you're going to lose the contracts. Kimmel found out about that. He decided he was going to go to Washington and fight this Pearl Harbor matter. Harris said, don't do it, because they will ruin you if you take that course. Kimmel said, well, I made up my mind, so I'm going to resign. I don't want to cause you any embarrassment. Admiral Harris refused to accept my grandfather's resignation and continued to pay him all through his trials and tribulations through the next 4 years. That information was given to the Dorn investigators, and they opted not to include it in their report. At this point in my talk, I start to get a little exercised, and I need to lighten up. And the best way that I've been able to lighten up in the past is to accept the counsel of the legendary football coach, Vince Lombardi. So I'm going to leave you with this comment.
What the hell's going on out here?
What's that?
What the hell's going on out here?
Historians now, this Pearl Harbor matter really is left in the hands of historians. Historians have helped us, and some historians have done immeasurable damage to us. And this little report that I'm about to give you is about 4 minutes long, and it'll demonstrate to you what hung us up for 6 years until we got this straightened out.
Well, this seemed to be a devastating criticism of Admiral Kimmel. If he had such a clear warning in front of him that any attack would come from a specific sector, he should have done everything he could to guard that sector. But two things must be said about that. First, Admiral Kimmel believed, and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, his replacement afterwards, similarly agreed with this, that any search worth its name must be 360 degrees in breadth. And as for the Martin Bellinger report, that was a report that was compiled and given to Admiral Kimmel on March 31, 1941 by Major General Frederick Martin and Rear Admiral Patrick Bellinger. Martin commanded the U.S. Army Air Corps on the island, and Patrick Bellinger was commander of all of the patrol aircraft. After I read that damning statement in the book by Gordon W. Prang and Donald M. Goldstein, I went to the library of the University of Florida and looked through the massive collection of documents that recount the Pearl Harbor hearings conducted from 1941 to 1945 in one form or another. And all of the collected documents that were used by the various hearing bodies are in that collection. And I found the Martin Bellinger report in 4 different places in that collection. And I read the first account I discovered avidly to find where this warning was given, and it was not there. There was nothing in the Martin Bellinger report about the northern sector being the most dangerous sector. There was nothing about any sector being more dangerous than any other. The word north does not even appear in the document. nor does any numerical or nautical equivalent. These people, Prang and Goldstein, had lied, and so baldly that I wondered why it hadn't been picked up in the years intervening between 1986 and the year 1999 when I discovered this. It was quite an extraordinary bit of misinformation that has, of course, led many people astray in understanding the whole Pearl Harbor story. In 2001, which was the 60th anniversary of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, I attended a conference in Honolulu put on by the National Park Service, to which many historians of the Pearl Harbor attack had been invited, one of them, Donald Goldstein. And when it came my time to speak, I confronted him with the document. I went through all four of the documents as they were collected in the hearings volumes, and they were all identical. So I held up a copy of the Martin Bellinger report, and I said, Dr. Goldstein, there is nothing in this report that states that the northern sector or any other sector was more dangerous than any others. Why did you make the statement that you did in your book, Pearl Harbor, The Verdict of History? And he made no reply. He chuckled and laughed it off. And I said, it's only 7 pages long. It wouldn't take you long to read it at all. I have it here for you to read. And he chuckled it off, and the audience, I must say, chuckled with him. And so I tried to make the point then, and I'm trying to make the point here once more, that Admiral Kimmel was never given such a warning, and he is not guilty as charged.
Captain Joe Taussig won the Navy Cross on the Nevada at Pearl Harbor, lost a leg in the process by beaching it. At any rate, Captain Taussig spent quite a career with the Navy and rose to great heights. He had this to say about radar on December 7, 1941. I do not think it strange that the so-called radar warning was ignored. For as Sir Winston might have put it, it had much to be ignored about. On 7 December 1941, this experimental equipment was extremely unreliable, mostly because it was, so to speak, false return prone. A flight of gulls, for example, could snafu the entire system, and anyone purporting to see a flight of bombers on an A-scope circa December 1941 was indeed a seer of great perception. One aircraft made the same mess on the scope as 100, and any number of boats, ships, and seagulls could do the same thing. This is all prior to IFF technology and such. This is what Admiral Kimmel's testimony was about the aircraft warning system. I took Army personnel to sea with the fleet so that they could be trained as radar operators. I assigned to the Army a naval officer who had experience in Britain with radar to give any advice and assistance he could in connection with the aircraft warning net in Hawaii. It has been reported by some historians that Kimmel made no effort to contact the air warning system during Pearl Harbor, which is completely at odds with his testimony before the Naval Court of Inquiry, where he made it abundantly clear that he and Bellinger and co. had tried many times to reach the air warning system, but they couldn't get through on the telephone. Comment about guns at Pearl Harbor and why only 29 planes were shot down? You want that one?
Yeah, sure.
Have we had enough? No. Pearl Harbor guns. In sum and substance, the fleet actually lacked an anti-aircraft protection worthy of the name. The Naval Court of Inquiry said this as well. They said you cannot compare the miserable state of our gunfire on Navy ships in 1941 with what we eventually had in 1943, 44, 45. It is, in fact, remarkable that any Japanese aircraft were actually shot down by these batteries. This was not the fault of the crews. They were drilled incessantly and performed perfectly. It was purely a matter of equipment. The weaponry intended to defend against the attack was incapable of meeting the threat posed by the Japanese. Thank you very much.
Question for Mr. Kimmel. What do you think of the theories that have been expressed by Mr. Johns?
Which one? The most significant piece of information, if it's true, would be this warning phone call from Churchill to FDR on November 26, 1941. Well, it just so happens I know an awful lot about that. This was claimed by a fellow by the name of Gregory Douglas, writing under that name. He has several aliases. He called me up when I was still in the FBI in 1995, told me he had just written a book about this. It's the first of 4 books that he's written about Heinrich Müller, the head of the Gestapo, the only head of the Gestapo, who was purportedly wiretapping the transatlantic cable. David Kahn goes into this in some considerable detail, trying to flesh out what's true and what's not true about this. Interestingly, General Marshall, testifying before the Joint Congressional Committee, is asked about the transatlantic cable and said that Churchill and Roosevelt talked on this cable all the time, and that he, Marshall, had counseled FDR and Churchill on numerous occasions not to talk on that transatlantic cable because the Army itself, excuse me, had figured out a way to intercept it through an induction process. So they knew it was not secure. So the real question is just how much did Churchill and Roosevelt speak on that cable? The text of the purportedly intercepted conversation, intercepted incidentally by the German postal authorities, and turned over, German postal authorities, and turned over to the Gestapo, purportedly. That original transcript is in English, and Gregory Douglas, or whatever his real name is, sent me the original, which I have. I spent at least 10 years trying to figure out the truth or lack thereof of this communication. And except for the fact that some Canadians have somewhat confirmed this, the biggest problem I've had is with the Director of Central Intelligence under Ronald Reagan, William Casey. He wrote a book about defeating Hitler. Can't quite remember the name of the book. I think it was 1987. I think it's on page 7 or 9, I can't remember right now, where he said that the British had warned us before the attack that the Japanese task force was steaming towards Hawaii. Now this was just before Director of Central Intelligence Casey deceased, so we were never able to go back and ask him about that. All right, I'll give you the short of it here because I see he's getting up, but I did mention I know a lot about this. I have determined that the author, Gregory Douglas, I have determined that he's a fraud, at least to my own satisfaction. So I was contacted by a fellow by the name of Mo Shervastava, who was an academic out of MIT and a math professor out of the University of Illinois by the name of Phil Kushner. They asked me if I would send them a copy of this purported original document, which I agreed to do, and they asked me if I would co-author with them an article about it. And we have done that. And if you want a copy of it, you send me an email and I'll send it to you. But you have to claim to be a friend of mine or I can't send it to you. I wanted to put it on my website, but there are some proprietary interests in this. And the website is www.pearlharbor911attacks.com.
Every book I read said that the Japanese fleet practiced total radio silence. Are you disagreeing with it now, John, or you, Tom?
The short answer, which I'm gratified to be able to give you quickly, is I don't know. There are indications that they broke radio silence. There are other indications they did not. It's still an open question in my mind. Probably the most significant unexplained information about breaking radio silence has to do with the experience of the lure line tracking the WWII when they stopped to refuel, doing this while they were in transit, while the lure line, a U.S. Ship, was in transit from San Francisco to Hawaii, reporting the track of what they've presumed was an attacking force. And they had no idea whether it was true or not, but they speculated it. And then we later found out that they had predicted just when the Japanese had stopped to refuel. They knew it. Again, I don't know, but here's the communication that was sent to me by Gregory Douglas concerning Heinrich Müller. Are you familiar with the book? Well, here's the actual communication. You can read precisely the pertinent parts, which I've highlighted for you here. Well, Churchill's B, FDR's A. No, at this moment, says Churchill, their forces are moving across the northern Pacific, and I can assure you that their goal is a little bit of German there, fleet in Hawaii at Pearl Harbor. Again, if you want a copy of this thing, send me an email. I'll send you a copy of it. I do hasten to add that my analysis of this over 10 years is that this was a fraud. I know this guy, Pete Stahl. I know him rather well. I talked to him for hours over a long period of time. He had served time in prison for counterfeiting. Now, I also hasten to add, I could be wrong. I could be wrong. But I wrote the paper in hopes that he would offer his rebuttal in saying that my paper is wrong. But instead, he chooses to go through an ad hominem attack and offers no rebuttal. I would be eager for him to come back.
Tom, you had mentioned the fact that actually in the Philippines, Admiral Hart had magic and was aware, actually, and from what I understand, even General Douglas MacArthur also was aware of the fact that they were going to get attacked, not December 7th, which Pearl Harbor was attacked at, but one day later on December 8th, and they didn't or weren't prepared to do anything. And it certainly sounded like no one in the Philippines, after they got decimated, almost as bad, especially on their Air Force, that Kimmel and Stark had, and nothing was done in connection with their command as far as being relieved of command. Can you please comment on that? What do you think about that?
I think General MacArthur explained it in his reminiscences of why that occurred, and his explanation was he was told to let the Japanese commit the first overt act, and he did. They were all under orders. Those were the orders that was controlling everything. Let the Japanese commit the first overt act. It was a brilliant strategy by Franklin Roosevelt, as it turned out, because the greatest American generation suddenly came together, the so-called sleeping giant, and won the war. If the Japanese had just sort of eased into the Philippines, we would probably have had another Vietnam situation with a hopelessly divided country.
Thank you for coming up. Tom, thank you for coming to Minnesota. Jack, thank you. I wish we discovered you sooner. Jim, Bud Nakasone, come up and give them a personal Minnesota warm welcome. See you next month.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.